The writer David Foster Wallace has said, "There's no such thing as not worshiping. Everyone worships. The only choice we get is what to worship." Hundreds of years ago, those who fled here from Europe sought a haven to worship freely, to be able to live out their faith. America became a safe harbor for religious freedom. This safe harbor grew to be a prosperous nation and was a light to the world in the areas of religious freedom and human rights. More recently, in terms of our religious freedom advocacy abroad, the United States was integral to the development of the international human rights framework that followed World War II and the horrors of the Holocaust. At the time, it was clear that Christian beliefs informs human rights for the United States and for other nations, and religious freedom is a major part now of the human rights framework we deal with today. Only when we recognize that all human beings are created in the imago Dei, the image of God, do we even have a basis for the notion of human rights. These religious freedom protections internationally are reflected in Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the same article of the treaty that followed, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which states that everyone shall have the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right shall include the freedom to have or to adopt a religion or belief of his choice, and freedom to manifest his religion or belief in worship, observance, practice, and teaching. In addition, no one shall be subject to coercion which would impair his freedom to have or adopt a religion or belief of his choice. The United States has ratified this treaty and follows it, unlike the many other nations which agreed to it but don't take their human rights obligations seriously. While the United States has made this vision of religious freedom part of its foreign policy in the past, we are in danger of losing this today. Human rights concerns alone should lead us to protect religious freedom abroad, but if this is not enough, there are security and economic reasons for doing so too. To further discuss religious freedom abroad and give us an update on where it stands in key areas around the world, we are joined today by the Honorable Frank Wolf. Former Congressman Frank Wolf is the Distinguished Senior Fellow of the 21st Century Wilberforce Initiative, an organization working to advance the human right of religious freedom around the world through advocacy, capacity building, and technical innovations. He was elected to Congress in 1981 and served Virginia's 10th District for 17 terms, during which time he was a stalwart defender of religious freedom. Congressman Wolf authored the International Religious Freedom Act and legislation to create a State Department Special Envoy for religious minorities in the Near East and South Central Asia. The founder and co-chair of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission, Congressman Wolf's honors include the 2015 Wilson Chair in Religious Freedom at Baylor University, the Presidential Eleanor Roosevelt Award for Human Rights, and the Chuck Colson Center for Christian Worldview's William Wilberforce Award. Congressman Wolf, welcome.
Well, thank you, Travis, and I want to thank FRC for the great work that they do. Many of you might know the words of the song, The Boxer, that Simon and Garfunkel sang in Central Park a number of years ago. It says, "Man hears what he wants to hear, but disregards the rest. There are the cries of the persecuted that we in the West are refusing to hear." I have a grave and a growing sense of urgency regarding the erosion of religious liberty at home and abroad. All over the world, people of faith are denied the fundamental, inalienable human right to confess and express their faith according to the dictates of their conscience. According to a Pew survey, 75% of the world live in a religiously repressive nation, meaning roughly 5.5 billion people. President Ronald Reagan, who one of the finest presidents we've ever had, said the words in the Constitution and the words in the Declaration of Independence were a covenant not only with the people of Philadelphia in 1776 and 1787 when the Constitution was ratified, but a covenant with a Catholic priest who's in jail today, a covenant with a Catholic nun who's being faced with genocide in Iraq, a covenant with a Buddhist monk in Tibet that's being faced with oppression by the religious government. And that covenant is now being shredded from China to Iran to Egypt, for Pakistan, Vietnam. The face of repression varies, but the outcome's the same. It's harassment, fear, imprisonment, and even death, simply because of what a person believes. China, Catholic bishops are under house arrest. Protestant pastors are in jail. Liu Xiaobo, the 2010 Nobel Prize winner, nobody cared about him, died in prison. Chinese lawyers are arrested and tortured. In Tibet, 130 Tibetan monks and nuns have poured kerosene on their body, lit a match, and killed themselves in protest to the Chinese government, and nobody says a word. The Uyghurs, the Muslim group in China, are being persecuted. And just yesterday, Voice of America announced that China is sending a high number of Uyghurs to re-educational camps, and yet the West is silent. Chinese companies, really fronts for the Chinese government, are purchasing major Western movie theater chains like AMC and are buying up movie studios in the United States, which will make it difficult, if not impossible, for movies to be produced that are in any way critical of the Chinese government and their record for human rights and religious freedom. In Iraq, genocide has taken place against Christians and Yazidis, and more biblical activity has taken place in Iraq than any other country of the world other than Israel. Abraham is from Ur, which is modern-day Nasiriyah. Daniel is buried in Iraq. He spent all his life in Iraq. Ezekiel is buried in Iraq. 3 years ago, ISIS blew up Jonah's tomb. The Christian community has dropped from 1.5 million in 2003, now down to 250,000, and maybe even less. We are ready to see, if bold action is not taken, we will see the end of Christianity in the cradle of Christendom. And at this very moment that I speak, 3,000 young Yazidi women are being held by ISIS, and the Yazidis are being persecuted. It is important for our government to help the Christians and the Yazidis to stay and to return to their villages. With some notable exceptions, the church in America has not been seized with a crisis facing the church in Iraq or the Middle East or Syria or Egypt or China. To a person, when I was there last month, every Christian we met with in Iraq expressed a pervasive sense of abandonment. These courageous men and women of faith can't understand, while burning the churches, forced conversion, and genocide in the cradle of Christendom is not being met with urgency and action by fellow believers in the West. In Nigeria, terrorism, Boko Haram has signed an agreement, has pledged his allegiance to ISIS, and almost 20,000 Christians have been killed by Boko Haram and Fulani militants. And yet the church in the West and our governments in the West are saying almost nothing. You remember 3 years ago, the Chibok girls, 200 Christian girls in the town of Chibok were kidnapped by Boko Haram. The world did hashtag bring back our girls. All the leaders of all the governments. Half of the girls have not come back. Have you seen anybody mention the Chibok girls lately? And we were there, we met with a counselor who said, here's what he's telling the parents. 1, your daughter may never come back. 2, if she comes back, she will be pregnant or she will have a child. 3, she will be forced to convert to Islam. And yet, the silence of all those people who did hashtag bring back our girls, the silence we hear is deafening. There's much more that could be said about persecution of people of faith. In Egypt, Coptic Christian pastor just killed yesterday. In Vietnam, persecuting the Catholic Church and the Buddhists. In Iran, the Baha'is are being crushed. The Baha'is are mild-mannered people. They're being crushed, and nobody speaks out for the Baha'is. In Sudan, 2.1 million people died, and the Bashar government, he's an indicted war criminal, and we very seldom hear anyone say anything about Sudan. And growing anti-Semitism. There's growing anti-Semitism spreading around the world, and even on American college campuses. And in Pakistan, there's a Christian woman, Asia Bibi, B-I-B-I, who's been in jail under a death sentence, not charged, sentence, for blasphemy for taking a drink out of a cup of water. And the church in the West is silent. It'd be foolishness to suggest that people of faith in our country, in America, are experiencing even a fraction of the persecution I've just described in Iraq, in Nigeria, and China. However, Cardinal Francis George, former president of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops in 2010 predicted. Here's what Cardinal George said. He said, I expect to die in my bed. My successor will die in prison. And his successor, he said, will die a martyr in the public square. Is this alarmist, unnecessarily dramatic? I pray so, but the evidence demands an examination of the prospect. That said, despite the constitutional protections that religious freedom has historically enjoyed in our country, its sacred standing in the American experiment is daily being encroached upon. That's what you're going to hear with regard to the panels. Moreover, as our brothers and sisters around the world are facing existential threats to their very survival, I personally am convinced that as they who are being persecuted become more than faceless, nameless victims in distant wars and hard-to-pronounce prison cells, and that as we commit to knowing their stories, weeping at their wounds, and interceding on their behalf through prayer and advocacy, that we will find ourselves shaped by these men and these women, these giants of the faith. And I believe that if we're clear-eyed about the times in which we live, I believe these encounters with these giants will make our own faith more robust and strengthen us for the days ahead. In closing, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, in the end, we will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. Dr. King talked about silence. And in closing, German Lutheran pastor and anti-Nazi dissident Dietrich Bonhoeffer said, silence in the face of evil is evil itself. Dr. Bonhoeffer said, not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. So it's important that we speak, and then it's important that we really act. Thank you very much.
Just as we are called to advocate for religious freedom around the world with the basis being the human right of religious freedom, for hundreds of years we've also worshiped freely in this country with the First Amendment, the Free Exercise Clause, protecting us and guiding us. More recently, statutes like the Religious Freedom Restoration Act have reflected the will of the people to have strong protections for religious liberty here at home. There is good reason to have these, and good reason to demand that the government reach a high bar before infringing on the average private citizen's religious exercise. Moreover, our religious freedom protections at home and advocacy at home give us the credibility to promote it abroad. Yet the status of our religious freedom at home has changed in recent times. While the issue did not used to be controversial, it now is, primarily due to the legal and cultural impact of the individual sexual rights agenda and the collision of that agenda with religious freedom and the ability of many to live out their faith in their daily lives. We find religious freedom threatened like never before due to the demands of this movement. Now, some might say that's an overstatement, but if you examine what's happening, if we examine what's going on, look at the halls of cultural power today. Just take a look at them. Big business, media, entertainment, pop culture, academia, and the like. Find where Christian teaching on sexuality is accepted in any of those spheres of influence. It isn't. Due to this, we have an unprecedented religious freedom crisis on our hands, and we are only seeing the tip of the iceberg. The problems that are coming are contained in the part that is below the surface. Many will see themselves affected soon. Others have already been impacted, but just haven't spoken up. Now the adverse consequences are at the doorstep of small business owners, religious institutions, public officials, those more in the public square, like Jack Phillips, the small business owner whose case is before the Supreme Court. But the forces affecting those in that area will not stop. They'll eventually come to churches and to every Christian who holds to these beliefs. To give us a glimpse of some of these problems we have with us today, some of those for whom the issue has already come to their doorstep and whose religious freedom has been impacted by the sexual rights agenda. Amy Lawson owns Amy Lynn Photography Studio, a small photography business in Madison, Wisconsin. She joins us today, along with Carl and Angel Larson, who own Telescope Media Group in Minnesota. With us also is one of their attorneys from Alliance Defending Freedom, Kellie Fiedorek. Amy, I'm going to start with you, and just to give the audience a glimpse of of your story and what's happened in your life. Why don't you tell us just from the beginning in terms of your business, how did you get involved in the creative design business?
Well, I've always considered myself to be a creative, artistic person, but photographs are especially important to me. When I was 5, by the time I was 5, I had already lost 3 out of my 4 grandparents. So it was really important for me to feel like I could get to know them and remember them. And thankfully, my parents had boxes of old black and white photographs. They had a box of love letters that my grandfather had written to my grandmother while he was deployed. And so I'd take some of those photographs and I would take them to my dad and ask him to tell me stories. And occasionally he would oblige. And as I got older, in high school, I started scrapbooking because I realized I wanted to tell my family's story through photos, but also through that text. And that eventually led me to start my photography business as I realized that I needed to learn to take better photos if I was going to accurately record my family's history.
And so you started the business, and just could you talk a little bit about how you view your faith through the business and living out your beliefs through that business?
About 4 years ago, I married my husband Brian and we moved to Madison, Wisconsin. And at that point, I felt a renewed passion to photograph not just my family story, but record family stories, marriage stories, stories of God's goodness in people's lives. And because of that, I started my business in 2015 so that I could record these stories in a professional manner.
So it's important for you to live out your faith through the business, and this was something that you just very naturally sought to do.
Yes.
Okay. So Kellie, could you just kind of come in here and just provide us with an insight in terms of what happened then for Amy and in terms of the freedom of her business to live out her faith through the business?
Well, absolutely, and it's great to be on this panel with all of you and really appreciate Family Research Council putting on this great event. As Congressman Wolf mentioned, there's obviously a great persecution happening internationally. We're also seeing it here at our own doorstep. We sort of like to call it a more polite persecution. And one of the greatest threats to religious liberty and to free speech comes in the form of non-discrimination laws. These are laws that have added new classifications, usually including sexual orientation, gender identity, and in Amy's case as well, some of these laws, especially at the local level, also prevent or say you can't discriminate based on political affiliation. Which, you think about what that would mean, it can mean that, well, if you're a speechwriter and you don't want to write a speech for President Obama or President Trump, depending on your political views, under the law in Madison, for example, the government could come after you and could not only fine you, but could cost you a substantial amount of money. So what happened in Amy's case is that both the Madison non-discrimination law as well as the statewide law threatened her artistic freedom, her freedom to be able to photograph events consistent with her beliefs. And unfortunately, we're seeing these laws impact more and more people because the government is using them as a sword to come after individuals who simply want to express their beliefs about marriage, about life, beliefs that now happen to be somewhat countercultural. But the government should never be able to have the power to come after anybody and tell them what to think or what to believe or how to run their business. And even if they disagree with their viewpoint on marriage, the government should protect all of us and all of our freedoms. And unfortunately, in Amy's case, the law threatened her, so we filed a lawsuit on her behalf to defend those artistic freedoms.
And you guys had a victory in that case, right?
We did. We were very excited to have this victory. The court ruled just a couple months ago that the law cannot force a public accommodation that does not have an actual storefront. So her business is online, she works from her home. They can't force Amy or any other creative professional like Amy in the state of Wisconsin to violate their freedoms, that she and all creative professionals are free to photograph and participate in those events that are consistent with their conscience. So this is a really big victory for religious freedom.
And Amy, since that victory, you were able to now photograph your first wedding through the business. What was that experience like?
It was really exciting. Over the last year, I've had the opportunity to take some time to get some continuing education and hone my skills. And in September, I was able to be an assistant photographer at a wedding. That was really exciting to kind of get my feet wet again. And next year I have a super sweet bride and groom booked already. I'm really excited about that. One of the things I'm most excited about, though, is also being able to volunteer with my time to organizations. And for instance, I am really excited about working with an organization that will allow me to volunteer my photographic skills to new mothers whose babies are in NICU, and I'm really excited about being able to record for them the first few days of their baby's life out of the womb.
She's now free to be able to do that because the court ruled that these really these laws that are coercing her freedom, that they rule that does no longer apply to her. So she's now free to be able to serve those and bring that joy to people's lives.
Definitely a neat story about just your experience, your business, and a testimony to the importance of fighting and pushing back to protect your freedom and the types of freedoms we need to protect for many small business owners throughout the country in these scenarios involving that conflict between the sexual rights agenda, same-sex marriage, and religious freedom. Carl and Angel, I want to turn to you now and just give us a brief background in terms of your business, Telescope Media Group, in terms of the story behind that. Could you just share a little bit along those lines?
Yeah, thanks again for having us. This is, so 10 years ago, my wife and I started Telescope Media Group. We're a video production company, and right on the very first day, right on the front of our website, we said, we exist to glorify God through top quality media production. Over the years, when I was in college, I was a physics major, but I really had this interest in photography and telling stories, and just got in that world because I was passionate about telling people about Jesus and who he was, and because he'd changed my life. And so we came up with the name Telescope because a number of theologians I was reading in college pointed out this reality that God is great, he's beautiful, he's glorious, and sin separates us from him in a way that we don't see him the way we ought to see it. So if we can see him clearly, like a telescope does, to see something great and grand more clearly, we wanted to create media that does that. So not like a microscope making something small look big, we want to make something beautiful and grand and great look like it really is through the work that we do. So we've operated successfully for 10 years with a broad range of clients. Not all clients are Christian clients. We believe the Bible, and the Bible says glorify God in all that you do. And so we can work with a broad range of people, but the problem is we're not going to promote all messages. And so over the years, our business, we want to follow Jesus, and we realize that marriage is a central theme in our lives. I've actually officiated a few weddings. We've done a number of premarital counseling sessions with people in our church. We just love marriage, and so we want to tell those stories. And as we started exploring those options for our business, we realized that the state of Minnesota had aggressively set up laws and regulations saying that if we would enter into that marketplace to tell stories about the glory of God, about marriage, then we would also have to tell all stories about marriage, stories that are directly in contradiction with that. So we challenged the law in Minnesota, and that's how we ended up here today.
Angel, in terms of how you and Carl live your lives, I mean, it's obvious how you're seeking to live out your faith through the business, but could you talk a little bit about how you guys view your home and just bringing people into your home and cultivating a dialogue with those with diverse viewpoints?
Yeah, we love all people, and we actually have 8 children, 2 that are adopted and 1 that we're raising as our own, and we can't travel the world very efficiently. And so we decided that quite a few years ago that we were going to bring the world to our table. And as part of doing that, we love international students and college students. And so when you first time you come to my house, you get to sign your name underneath our table, and it makes you feel like you're a part of our family. And also, we have a big wall map, and with the first time that you come, you get to scratch off your country. So my kids, it's a rich place to raise my children. They don't even know how blessed they are to experience cultures week after week of people that are very different from us, but it's a great experience.
And you had something kind of unique happen last night, right?
I have been discipling a young woman, a Liberian woman, who's single. I met her about 7 months ago, and she had been contemplating an abortion. And so I come alongside of her these past 7 months. She carried the baby to term, and last night she called me at 10 o'clock and said, "My water broke. Please come to the hospital." And so I spent as much time as I could. I had to leave her at 4 a.m. to get a catch-up flight here, and found out at 7:30 that the baby was born healthy, and it's amazing.
So it's obvious for you two that you're seeking to live your faith out in so many areas of your lives. It's understandable that you're naturally going to seek to live your faith through your business. And it's coming to the lawsuit here in terms of the conflict with this non-discrimination law. Carl, if you can just talk a little bit about what made you want to get in the middle of all this. Couldn't you have just kind of gone on your merry way and not brought the suit or not gotten involved in some legal dispute?
Sure. The same biblical view that causes us to believe that all people are created in the image of God also informs our view of marriage. And so we want to tell the stories about marriage because we believe that's one of the fundamental ways that God reveals himself to the world. The Bible begins with a marriage story, it ends with a marriage story. And we want to tell those stories. Now, the issue that we're facing is that we just simply can't promote every single message that comes in our door, just like every other creative professional. And so when we thought about challenging the law and what would really be at stake is, I just simply want to echo what was already said earlier about Bonhoeffer. To see an injustice and to do nothing about it is to participate in that injustice itself, right? Nobody should be under force of government to promote messages that they don't agree with. And that's if you agree with me, and that's if you don't. And so with all the cases that are involved currently in the public eye, Jack Phillips, or whichever case you want to select, whatever the opinion is, freedom is a good thing. Being able to operate according to your core beliefs is good for everyone. And so we want to make sure that everyone understands that this case is about freedom for everyone, regardless of what they believe. We really want to hold to that and make sure that everyone is free, because that's where all these freedoms travel together.
Now, for expressing your beliefs in this area, you've received some real pushback, some real hatred directed at you online. Can you talk about what that was like in terms of how you responded to it and how you dealt with that?
Well, first I would say that our identity is in Christ, and so you can say all you want about me, about our family, about my hair. It was a big topic. But ultimately, I'm also defending your right to say those things to me. And so that's one thing that we really, really want the world to understand, that we are for everyone to have freedom.
Kellie, if you could come in here and, we've discussed these stories here in terms of the conflict with the sexual rights agenda and religious freedom. As many likely know, there's a case before the Supreme Court, the case of Jack Phillips and Masterpiece Cake Shop, that the court will decide within this next year, dealing with a very similar scenario. So if you can just talk about the importance of that case in light of what we've discussed here and how these issues are related a bit.
Absolutely. I think just to put it in context, Carl and Angel and Amy, they're just three of many people who are currently facing this kind of punishment and coercion at the hands of the government with the threat of these types of laws. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Jack Phillips. He's one of our clients whose case is, as Travis said, at the U.S. Supreme Court. He's a baker from Colorado, and Jack serves everyone who comes in his store. It doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter whether you're gay or not, he will serve anyone. But like most creative professionals, as they were talking about today, he can't celebrate every event. He can't custom create art for every event. And yet the Colorado Human Rights Commission, the state of Colorado, is trying to force him to do so. And his case has now made it all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And so at stake before the court is whether or not the government should be free to do this, or whether or not government forcing someone to violate their conscience and to speak a message that they disagree with violates their most fundamental First Amendment freedoms. Because at stake here is not only religious freedom, but it's also free speech. Can the government come in and tell you what to create and what to perform? And so regardless of what one's viewpoints are on same-sex marriage, whether you're supportive of same-sex marriage or you're not, we all have the same freedoms, and the government has to protect everyone. And so what you've seen here, that's Jack's case, so be praying for that case. Oral argument there is December 5th. My colleague Kristen Wagner will be arguing that case, not only for Jack, but for each and every one of us, for our freedom to continue to peacefully live and to work consistent with our most sincerely held beliefs. So the laws that are affecting Jack, are affecting Baronell, they're affecting Amy, they're affecting the Larsons, and that's why we're so thankful for the Larsons' courage to stand up against the state of Minnesota and this law that is silencing them. It's attempting to silence who they are. And they didn't mention this, but in addition to fines in the state of Minnesota, you can go to jail for up to 60 days if you're found guilty of violating this particular law. That's a really terrifying place to be. So we have to come together and stand for these freedoms because they affect each and every one of us.
We're thankful for all of our panelists who appeared with us today on this panel. These are only a few stories, but there are many more, as Kellie mentioned, not just in the context of small business owners, but public officials, religious institutions, schools, and so many others, to include pastors and churches who are on a collision course with this sexual rights agenda here at home. These are religious freedom problems, just like those Congressman Wolf mentioned are occurring abroad. If you want to find out more about these, you can go to one simple resource to remember, frc.org/hostility report. And that's our compilation of religious freedom issues in these and other areas. In closing, let us not forget that the Christian faith compels us to care for the human rights and religious freedoms of others, whether at home or abroad. We can all be proud that it was Americans over 100 years ago who joined together to care for the Armenian people when they suffered genocide at the hands of the Ottoman Empire. Based on the notion that those people had human rights, Americans joined together, cared for them, responded to the action to the degree that they could. We always wish more could be done, but God forbid that we do less. We must view things today as no different. All people in positions of responsibility who have the ability to act must protect and promote religious freedom, whether at home or abroad. We must reclaim the vision of America, having a foreign policy strongly protective of religious freedom, just as we guard against its infringement at home. May our hearts be excited for this task, for it is a noble one, one worth living for. Thank you very much.